Greetings everyone, Mike here with Sci-Fi and more, and welcome back to the channel. And if you're new here, welcome to our Sci-Fi family. In the Halloween spirit of October, I wanted to put out a video that was more than sci-fi and more than horror. And fortunately, I got a great suggestion. That suggestion was for 1955's The Quatermass Experiment. This film was the first horror film by Hammer Films, and this one film put Hammer Films in the spotlight, making them the premier name for horror films throughout the 1950s, roughly through about 1970, all while making significant contributions to the sci-fi horror genre that sometimes don't always get recognized like they should. I would like to thank one of our subscribers for this, at Serpent Knight, who made the suggestion from our Subscriber Street segment and suggested putting the spotlight on the Quatermass Experiment for all the contributions it's made to sci-fi and horror. So, let's lock out that floating vampire child that is scratching at your window outside, grab some horrible Halloween candy corn, and explore the sci-fi horror contributions of the Quatermass Experiment. The Quatermass Experiment, also known as the Creeping Unknown in the United States, is a 1955 British science fiction horror film produced by Hammer Film Productions. The film is based on the 1953 BBC television serial The Quatermass Experiment, written by Nigel Kneale, directed by Val Guest, and produced by Anthony Hines. The movie stars Brian Donlevy as Professor Bernard Quatermass and Richard Wordsworth as Victor Carroon. The plot centers on three astronauts sent into space aboard a rocket designed by Professor Quatermass. The rocket crash lands with only Carroon aboard, who begins mutating into an alien organism that threatens to engulf and destroy humanity if it spawns. To better understand the film, it's essential to discuss the original 6-part TV serial that inspired it, which aired on the BBC in 1953. The series The Quatermass Experiment, created by Manx writer Nigel Kneale in 1953 and directed by Rudolph Cartier, was successful and led to 2 additional sequels, Quatermass 2 in 1955 and Quatermass and the Pit in 1958. Nigel Kneale himself, who began his career as a radio actor in the late 1940s, became a highly sought-after writer in the UK for both television and film. Among his many contributions to British screen culture, his creation of the Quatermass television serials for the BBC is particularly notable. These were, in fact, the first original adult science fiction dramas produced by the BBC for television, leaving a significant impact on the genre. The Quatermass Experiment's 6-episode series broadcast in the summer of 1953 and captivated viewers with the story of an astronaut returning to Earth with a hostile alien entity. Reginald Tate starred as Professor Quatermass in the series, but unfortunately only 2 episodes of the original series remain, as it was performed and broadcast live, with other episodes not recorded at the time. However, its successors, Quatermass 2 and Quatermass and the Pit, are preserved in the BBC archives. During the 1950s, the Quatermass serials played a crucial role in shaping the BBC's drama offerings. They were mainstream and widely popular, demonstrating that science fiction could appeal to a broad audience rather than being confined to a niche genre. Quatermass took science fiction to a captivated, often terrified British audience, leveraging the multi-camera format of the time to create something truly unique. Its influence is visible today in serialized drama and its themes of alien invasion, mysterious military operations, and unsettled settings. The Quatermass Experiment was a tremendous success with both critics and viewers, famously described by film historian Robert Simpson as event television that drew people away from the streets and the pubs. Among its audience was Anthony Hines of Hammer Films, who expressed interest in acquiring the film rights just 2 days after the final episode aired, eager to create a film adaptation. But more on that in a minute. Like its source TV serial, the film was a major success in the UK, but it also brought public attention to Hammer Film Productions around the world. Also, the Quatermass Experiment was considered a landmark of British science fiction television and a cornerstone of the genre by creating innovative multi-camera formats for the first time and developing a serialized drama that explored themes of alien invasion that were combined together in an innovative way to generate a combination of science fiction and melodrama. The show was so influential that the British Film Institute's Screen Online website describes the serial as one of the most influential series of the 1950s, adding that with its originality, mass appeal, and dynamism, the Quatermass Experiment became a landmark of science fiction and the cornerstone of the genre on British television. In fact, Quatermass proved such a hit that before the second BBC serial had ever aired, film adaptations of the script had begun, a franchise that kick-started the legendary Hammer Studios' successful turn towards a horror cinema that they would become famous for. In 1955, the Quatermass Experiment was brought to the big screen by director Val Guest and renamed the Quatermass Xperiment in order to celebrate its X certificate. This was followed by Guest's Quatermass 2 in 1957 and Roy Ward Baker's Quatermass in the Pit a decade later in 1967. Principal photography for the film began on October 12, 1954, starting with a night shoot at Chessington Zoo, and continued from October 18th into December of that year. The budget was only £42,000, which was low even by Hammer's standards. Special effects technician Les Bowie noted that the film was made on such a tight budget that he worked for wages rather than through your typical effects budget. The opening scenes of emergency services rushing to the rocket crash site were shot in the village of Bray, Berkshire, where Hammer Studios were located. The scenes with the crashed rocket were filmed in a cornfield at Water Oakley near Bray. Initially, the production intended to create a more spectacular crash by setting the field on fire, but unfortunately, bad weather prevented this. The film's director used a wide-angle lens to create a feeling of vastness in certain scenes, and the scene where Karoon encounters a little girl was filmed at the East India Docks in London. Additional location shots for the police search montage were conducted around London by a second unit. For the scene depicting the lights of London going out, an agreement was made with one of the engineers at Battersea Power Station to turn off the lights illuminating the outside of the station. However, a misunderstanding must have ensued because he briefly cut the power all along the River Thames. Most of the location shooting occurred in the Windsor area, while the rest of the movie was filmed at Hammer's Bray Studios, where sets for the hospital and the interior of Westminster Abbey were built and shot. Michael Carreras had requested permission to film at Westminster Abbey, but unfortunately he was denied. Instead, the rooms of Down Place, the country house around which Bray Studios was built, were used for various scenes, including Inspector Lomax's office. Although the Quatermass television serials were popular, the Hammer film adaptations had even more significant cultural influence, particularly internationally and in the United States. Influential figures like Stephen King, Joe Dante, John Landis, and Dan O'Bannon reportedly were greatly influenced after growing up watching and admiring these films. The unique sci-fi vision of Quatermass was rooted in its quintessential Englishness, portraying a recognizable yet eerily menacing version of post-war England. The setting featured numerous keep-out signs, pseudo-villages, and tube stations haunted by Martian insects. This unsettling depiction of a distorted society was especially evident in the second installment, Quatermass 2, where the professor, now portrayed by John Robinson, investigates an alien presence in the town of Winterden Flats. The legacy of the Quatermass stories created by Nigel Kneale is characterized by the clash of the ordinary with the extraordinary. This influence is evident in sci-fi and genre television that followed, such as Doctor Who and The Avengers. Beyond these shows, the distinctive, strange atmospheres of Quatermass have permeated other series on both sides of the Atlantic for decades, including A for Andromeda, Doomwatch, Black Mirror, and The X-Files. And this impact of Quatermass extends even more broadly across so many more programs that we could literally be here all day talking about it. The Quatermass Experiment movie is significant in film history as the first horror movie produced by Hammer Films, a studio which would become famous for its horror movies in the coming decade, which continued with 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein. It is also significant as one of the first film adaptations of a television program on either side of the Atlantic. Now, back to Anthony Hines, producer at Hammer Films, who quickly sought the film rights to a BBC serial just 2 days after its final episode aired. Now, the BBC, in all fairness, rejected Hammer's proposal, fearing that Hammer's reputation associated with B-movies would harm the serial's standing. Instead, the BBC preferred to work with Group 3 Productions and the production team of Frank Launder and Sidney Gilead. However, in the end, Hammer Films eventually secured the rights to adapt the Quatermass Experiment for two main reasons. First, they offered the BBC £2,000 and 20% of the film's profits. And secondly, unlike other contenders, Hammer Films was unafraid of the film receiving an X certificate. Now, if you are unfamiliar with the X certificate, it was the film rating created by the British Board of Film Classification in 1955 for films that were deemed only suitable for those 18 and over. basically our rated R. The screenplay for the Quatermass Experiment was initially drafted by American screenwriter Richard Landau, who had previously worked on Hammer's Spaceways. Director Val Guest then revised the script further. The BBC, holding the right to approve the script, enlisted Nigel Neal for additional revisions. Writing the film was challenging due to the need to condense the original 6-episode serial, which was a total of 240 minutes, into a feature film only running 82 minutes. The casting of Bernard Quatermass in the film led to some controversy between Hammer Films and the serial's creator, Nigel Neal. Hammer chose American actor Brian Donlevy for the role to increase the film's appeal to American audiences and secure U.S. distribution. Donlevy's portrayal of Quatermass was quite different from that of Reginald Tate in the original serial, where Tate's Quatermass was very British and cerebral. Donlevy's character was gruff and no-nonsense. Needless to say, Nigel Neal was not pleased with Donlevy's interpretation of Quatermass. The cast was rounded out by Jack Warner, on loan from the Rank organization, as Inspector Lomax, Richard Wordsworth, the great-great-grandson of poet William Wordsworth, as the tragic astronaut Caroon, and former beauty queen Margia Dean as Caroon's wife Judith. To maximize the box office potential, Hammer Films released the Quatermass Experiment to coincide with the BBC's broadcast of the sequel series, Quatermass 2, which aired from October 22nd to November 25th in 1955. The Quatermass Experiment went into wide release on September 28, 1955, after premiering at the London Pavilion on August 26, 1955. Initially, it was paired with the Eric Winstone Band Show, but due to the BBFC restrictions on X certificate, Rififi, a French caper film directed by Jules Dassin, replaced it for wide release. And this new double bill proved to be the highest grossing double bill of the year in the UK. Finding a distributor for the Quatermass Experiment in the United States was challenging. Initially intended for release by 20th Century Fox, the studio passed on the film because it wasn't shot in their required CinemaScope or widescreen process. American producer Robert L. Lippert, who had co-financed the film, approached Columbia, but they also declined. They renamed the film The Creeping Unknown, and Lippert eventually interested United Artists, which purchased the rights for $125,000. The film's success led United Artists to not only request a sequel from Hammer Films, but to also offer to partially finance and double the sequel's budget. The original serial, The Quatermass Experiment, spawned 3 sequels on the BBC, with Hammer Films adapting 2 of them, Quatermass 2 in 1957 and Quatermass in the Pit in 1967. The Quatermass Experiment served as a precursor to Hammer's horror films of the late 50s and early 60s, beginning with The Curse of Frankenstein in 1957. However, unlike Hammer's later films, the Quatermass Experiment was shot in black and white with a cinema verde style and featured science fiction-based scenarios. In contrast, Hammer's subsequent horror films were shot in color and focused on Gothic horror. Nevertheless, the Quatermass Experiment demonstrated the potential for British horror films to be successful in both the UK and the US. The Quatermass Experiment significantly influenced prominent figures in horror. Director John Carpenter cited it as a major inspiration, even so much as to hire its creator, Nigel Neal, to write the original screenplay for Halloween 3's Season of the Witch. Although Neal later removed his name due to disagreements with producer Dino De Laurentiis over adding additional blood and gore to the film that he did not want to be associated with. Stephen King, in his book Danse Macabre, also highlighted Quatermass as one of his favorite horror films. Today, the Quatermass Experiment is well regarded for its deliberate pacing and thought-provoking content, and is still considered one of the most effective horror movies of the 1950s. And there you have it, Cosmic Core. We hope you have enjoyed our deep dive into the Quatermass Experiment. And if you did, please be sure to hit like and share the video. And if you feel we've earned it, please be sure to subscribe. It's one click for you, but it means the world to us. And I would also like to thank again our subscriber at Serpent Knight for this incredible suggestion. If you have a suggestion for a video that you would like to see, we run what we call Subscriber Street, where we want to hear from you. Let us know what you would like to see, and we will do our best to put that video together and get it out to you. Thank you again, everyone, for your continued support of our channel. This is our channel together. We would not be here without you. Thank you all again, and have a great galactic day.